Hi, I'm Russ Brialt with the Shroud of Turin Education Project, and welcome to the Shroud Report. My guest today is Ian Wilson, historian, author, and Ian, thank you for joining us here.
That's a pleasure.
And you probably more than anyone have advanced the knowledge of the Shroud with your landmark book in 1978, The Shroud of Turin, and famous places, secret faces, then there was your last one, which published last year, the Blood on the Shroud, and
I would say, I mean, I simply represent a lot of people who've been putting a lot of research into the Shroud. I've tried to sort of synthesize all their different findings, but that's, it's very much more than the...
And that's why I'm delighted that you're here, because on the Shroud Report, we've had a lot of folks on that have particular areas of specialty, but because you've looked at the global view, the whole topic, but let me just, before we go down that road, what got you interested in the Shroud in the first place?
It goes back a very long way. I was a schoolboy, 14, 15. I was completely agnostic. I was also, because I was a complete dunce at music, I was also very interested in art, and I thought I could actually look at any painting or section of painting and tell you the name of the artist, the century it's painted, or whatever. And in a magazine article I came across this picture of the Shroud face. And it said this had been around in Europe since at least the Middle Ages. And I looked at that and I just thought, this is not any painting, this is a photograph. And for it to come out of the Middle Ages, it can't exist. And it was the first thing that kind of rocked my agnosticism. And it took 10 years before I really began to take it seriously, but when I did begin to take it seriously, and I began to ask questions of it, so I became hooked, and I would never have believed that it would be all these years later that I'm still interested and still mystified by the subject. I think, for all that we think we found out in the last few decades, there's such a lot more that we still do not know.
Your particular area, as a historian, in your book in 1978, The Shroud of Turin, you laid out this new idea that the Shroud may be linked to another cloth that was in Constantinople and Edessa, and which you were able to establish a very solid historical trail, even going all the way back to 1st century. And I'm not going to ask you to go through that again here, but obviously one of the biggest problems, I would suppose, with Shroud researchers today is that we're up against a radiocarbon date that was done in 1988, saying that the Shroud is not 1st century, but that it has a date range of 1290 to 1360. As a historian, and believing that the Shroud does have that historical trail back to the 1st century, how do you reconcile that?
Right. Well, as far as my theory was concerned, I mean, there definitely was a historical object, which was a cloth with an impression of Jesus' face on it, which you can trace as a historical object between certainly the 6th century and 1204. And the whole thing rests on whether or not that was one and the same as our Turin Shroud. I still believe that that is one and the same, and in fact what is most interesting is that in the years since the carbon dating, it has in a sense been carbon dating that has wobbled, because people have sort of kind of fallen into this false notion that because it's all nice and clean and scientific, that it must be unquestionably correct. And the fact is that if you talk to archaeologists, they will often tell you that anomalies do occur in carbon dating, and I began to come across these cases of datings of mummy linens where they would date the body of the mummy and they would date the linen wrappings, and the linen wrappings would turn out to be 1,000 years younger than the body. And it was consistently that the linen was always younger than the body. And so the question is, was there something about linen that is peculiar, that might be responsible? We still really do not have clearly the answers, but one researcher who, in fact, does seem to have pointed the way is a specialist in microbiology, Dr. Garza Valdez, and his colleague, Professor Mattingly, who is head of microbiology at the University of Texas, San Antonio. And what they have shown is that many surfaces, but particularly linen, grow a kind of accretion of microorganisms that form a clear plastic coating on the surface. And that if you don't remove that surface, then you'll be dating partly living material as well as the original material of whatever date it might be.
And because carbon-14 is a ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14, if you do something, if you add recent material, you could conceivably throw off the ratio, so
That's
that
right.
even though the shroud may be 2,000 years old, the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 would look like, mathematically, it would look like it's much younger.
That's right.
Okay.
And that is what it does appear to have been the case. And it has recently been confirmed with a test that was done on an Ibis mummy.
Now, what is an Ibis?
An Ibis is a bird. We have them in Australia, and also they're in Egypt and other parts of the world. Long-billed bird, but they were sacred to the Egyptians.
And so they were also...
They were mummified, and so it was very easy, because the logic here was that one argument, so far as the difference in mummy linens from the body, was that perhaps the body had been rewrapped 1,000 years later. Well, in the case of Ibis mummies, there's no way that anyone would have bothered to rewrap one of these birds. Thousands were mummified because they were sacred, but you wouldn't go to an individual one and rewrap it.
Right.
And so there was a very good case for saying this one could not have been sort of rewrapped 1,000 years later. And then the coating was perceived on this mummy. A guesstimate was made from the depth of coating of about how many centuries the dating would be skewed. And Garza Valdez, in fact, said, well, if the difference between the body and the wrappings comes out any more than 500 years, because he saw it was thinner than the shroud, I will consider my argument vindicated. And indeed, the dating came out to around 600 years a difference.
So, and there again, the actual bird was dated 600 years older
than its wrappings.
Than the wrappings.
Yeah, and I say this has been the consistent pattern with every anomaly that you've had in this instance, is the wrappings always appear. What it appears to be is that linen has an amazing surface to it. If you take a piece of wood, then it's just a flat surface for the most part. But if you think of a linen and the way it's composed of threads, and those threads are composed of then millions and millions of individual fibres, each of those has a surface around it. And so the accretion that you can actually have from microorganisms that are actually living on this it is quite enormous.
So you could actually have a situation where you could have a tremendous amount of this organic, this secretion, because it can wrap around outside of the threads, the microfibrils.
That's right.
And so there's a tremendous amount of surface area for it to attach to.
I mean, the stupid thing is that I actually saw this in 1973 when I was able to see the shroud myself without realizing what I was looking at. I was very fortunate in '73 that I was invited to Turin and spent a period of about 8 hours overall, over 3 days, examining the shroud at close hand with no glass or anything like that. And the puzzle to me, I went expecting the cloth to be kind of falling apart and looking very tired and ancient looking. And I specifically say this in my 1978 book. It was surprising because it had a very damask-like surface sheen. And by that I was meaning it had a kind of surface body to it, like you get in a sort of fresh tablecloth. And so I think, for me, what I was seeing was that sheen. In fact, I was able to look at the samples that Garza Valdez had taken under the microscope, and have I been able to see this coating for myself? It is a coating that is definitely there.
It's definitely there.
It's like a natural lamination. Now, I make that as a judgment as a layman, but when I know that somebody, like Professor Mattingly, who is a fully accredited professor of microbiology, says yes, this coating is there, and basically the radiocarbon dating laboratories have got to reconsider.
They have to adjust that.
The way they have said.
Right.
Their results are so perfect.
This is fascinating, and I want to talk more about that. But we're gonna come right back to the Shroud Report in just a minute. I'm Russ Brialt, and welcome back to the Shroud Report. My guest today is Ian Wilson, historian, author. Ian, we've been talking about what possibly could have thrown off the carbon date on the shroud. Now, are there other things that you would look at aside from a bioplastic coating that may have conceivably altered the carbon date?
Yes, I think one has to look at what was the event that actually caused the image on the shroud in the first place. Dead bodies do not normally leave imprints of themselves. And from the very beginning, before any of the 1978 testing was actually done, people had been considering the idea that this image was created by some form of radiant energy. Now, and we're talking about a radiant energy that may also have been responsible for the event Christians call the resurrection. I mean, if this cloth is genuine, then it is, and I've used the word snapshot, as a snapshot of that moment, somehow created by the dematerialization of the body from the cloth. Now, we don't know the nature of that event, and I'm not a scientist. I can't talk in any kind of clear, detailed language about what might have occurred from that point of view, nor can any scientist, for that matter, when it comes down to an event of this kind. But I think we can sort of clutch at the idea that if we're dealing with a material body, that it may be its nuclear content that was somehow changed, and in that process, the nuclear content of the shroud itself was changed in some way, as I say, we just do not understand. I offer that sort of suggestion with every caution, because to me the beauty of the Garza Valdez hypothesis is that it doesn't demand any violation of any law of science, and we are seeing it apparently demonstrable. But at the same time, what the Garza Valdez hypothesis doesn't address is the question of the image. How that image got to be on the cloth is the $64,000 question of the shroud. And it may well, whatever event that was, may well have been also one that gave an aberrant reading for the carbon dating.
Now, I've read where scientists have done some experiments with neutron-type radiation and have irradiated linens and have actually been able to throw off the carbon date with by that process.
I think you're referring to the Kuznetsov experiments, where they basically arguing that the 1532 fire in which the shroud was involved, that because this was in a sealed cylinder, sealed casket at the time, that this might have actually sort of changed the carbon content of the shroud. Having talked to the carbon dating laboratories, they assured me before the carbon dating was done that, in fact, fire like that should not actually affect the result. I have since had my own reasons for seriously doubting the Kuznetsov hypothesis. He has sort of kind of gone to ground and hasn't been seen for a long while. And so my present feeling is to doubt that hypothesis and to go for the Garza Valdez hypothesis.
But to some extent, though, we probably need to be open for all possible hypotheses, because one of the problems with the carbon-14 dating that was done in 1988 was that instead of cutting the 3 samples from the shroud that was called for in the original protocol, they cut 1 sample site. and from the outside selvage edge, apparently in the middle of a scorch, and even in the middle of a water stain where the water had puddled after the fire in 1532 was doused. So there's a lot of people would say that, you know, this is ostensibly one of the worst samples that we could have selected, and without any other sample cut from the shroud, there's no way to test, to make any kind of comparisons.
I would agree with that. Yes, it would have been much better to take smaller samples from a series of different sites so that you get some representative picture of the whole. By taking just the one sample, any contaminant that might have been present there, and you see, 3 laboratories all being given samples from this one site, the result, whatever it was bound to be
the
same.
Right.
Whereas, and the site we know to have been the most unsuitable, certainly from the microbiological point of view, because, and it's a matter of history, you can look at depictions of expositions of the shroud over the centuries during the time that we know it to have been preserved in Turin and also before, and in Lorraine as well. In each of them, you see bishops holding the cloth up by the corners. And it was from precisely one of these very corners that this sample was taken. Now, you only have to touch any surface with your hand, and you can see that you leave a residue. Touch a piece of glass,
Right.
Professor Mattingly has demonstrated this. You put your hand in an agar dish, and a whole colony will grow over a period of time from all the microorganisms that are in your hand. You think of this process happening over so many centuries. It is very easy to see how colonies of microorganisms can grow on the thing, as is indeed the claim.
You're very close to the authorities in Turin and also Rome. There's going to be another exhibition here soon. After that, do you see that we'll be able to do more testing on the shroud? Do you think we'll ever get a chance to do carbon dating again and do it correctly this time?
Yes, I do. I mean, all depends on the regime of the time. The Pope has indicated that he would prefer not to have scientific testing before the year 2000, when the shroud is being brought out again, which I think is fair enough. But he's also indicated that he is open to further scientific work being done after that. I think what you do have to have is a kind of pause of a generation of science. I'm not talking about 25 years of a generation, but perhaps a few years, for a new series of developments to come along.
New technology.
New technologies. I mean, there are wonderful new technologies that are just coming into being. At this conference has been shown a new way of spectral imaging, whereby we should, without any destruction whatsoever, be able to determine beyond any reasonable doubt the chemical composition of what appears to be blood on the shroud. And also, hopefully, other elements to the shroud.
Well, that really is interesting, because it seems that in the history of the shroud, you do have these technological milestones that have revealed new things about the shroud. Whether it's Secondo Pia finding that the image is a negative when he took his first photograph, or whether it was the discovery of the three-dimensional nature of the shroud with the VP8 image analyzer in 1975. There could yet be new technology that we even have now that will reveal yet something else startling and new.
I believe so. I believe the shroud was in fact left for this generation, or this sort of. We're now to the 20th, 21st century, the scientific age. I think it was for our age of doubting Thomases. I think it is an unfolding drama, and I think we're very privileged to actually be witnesses of that drama as it is continuing to unfold. And I think the important thing is never to be too thrown or dismayed by the apparent adversities that you get with a situation like carbon dating. What is important is not to take too seriously any one aspect of science that may say that it knows all the answers. The great fascination of the Shroud is that so many different areas of science can all bring their expertise to bear on it, and it's all valuable expertise. And it's only by putting those all together that we can actually see something of the whole. I've often sort of made the analogy as a beautiful parable of the Buddha. And the Buddha just told the story of 5 blind men around an elephant. And each of those blind men sort of takes one part of the elephant. One grasps the tusk and says it's a spear, and another grasps a leg and says it's, oh, it seems like a trunk of a tree. A third grasps a tail and says, oh, it seems like some sort of broom. And the point of the parable is that each of them gets only a very, very imperfect view of the whole, and nobody gets it totally right. And that's going to be the same with all of us. This, I believe, this subject is bigger than all of us, and it is a Tantalus, but it's something that I think it is right for us to pursue. It is right for us to be humble towards, to be humble also to others of different opinion to ourselves. Listen to those who say, oh, it's a forgery and this is how it was done. It's important to be receptive to every point of view, whatever its hostility, because we can all only learn from each other so far as this cloth is concerned.
Again, it's fascinating, and the whole notion of new technology revealing something new just kind of makes you want to stay tuned, and that's what we're going to tell you to do right now, is to stay tuned. We'll be right back with the Shroud Report in just a minute. I'm Russ Brialt, and welcome back to the Shroud Report. Our guest is historian, author Ian Wilson. Ian, this has been fascinating, and there's something more in the future for what you're working on. And tell me what your next project is.
Well, as I've explained, I believe the Shroud was, in its early history, in a place that is today called Urfa in eastern Turkey. It was historically Edessa. And that's where the Shroud, in my theory, would have been up until 944. Now, the problem with Urfa is that it is today a totally Muslim town. There's absolutely not a single Christian church to be seen at all. You might never believe that anything like the Shroud had ever been there. And it has never been archaeologically excavated or surveyed. We know that back in the first millennium AD, it was bristling with churches. Quite aside from the Shroud, it was where the body of St. Thomas was brought. It was regarded as the first center of evangelization of Christianity. It was the first city to be evangelized to Christianity. That was the belief of the first millennium, whatever we may think today. And so there's a cathedral there, which is called the Sancta Sophia Cathedral, where the Shroud, I believe, was kept. But of course you can't see it. We can work out roughly where the location is, and the idea is to go there with a survey, an archaeological survey, whereby we actually find out for sure where that cathedral was. We track its foundations and so on, and we generally survey the whole thing to see what was where. The palace of the king who received the Shroud. There's a whole series of sites associated with the whole story of the coming of the Shroud to Edessa, and so it's not intended to be a full-scale dig, because this is a town which is fully inhabited.
Right.
But there's a citadel there which has never been excavated, which is clearly very historic indeed, and so it'll be a question of testing and to also do surveying and general exploration.
And what would you hope to find in this dig?
Well, there's no way we will find anything the Shroud was here. But as I would certainly hope to be able to plot the the actual foundations of the original cathedral of Edessa. It was a wonderful building.
Now, now, I read where the first church outside of Jerusalem was built in Edessa.
That's right.
In the 2nd century.
Yep.
Is that the church we're talking about?
No, it's a successor to that one,
Okay.
because what was probably the first church then became called the Great Church of Edessa. Then that was destroyed in a flood in 525 AD, and on that site they then built this beautiful cathedral. I mean, people, I think, are familiar with the Hagia Sophia or Sancta Sophia Cathedral in Constantinople. Well, this one in Edessa, although there's nothing to be seen today on the surface, was of that ilk. It was built by the same emperor. The Arab geographers of the 9th centuries were saying it's one of the wonders of the world. It was an object of absolute beauty, and sadly, as a result of history, and particularly sort of Muslim invasions, we just cannot see it when we go to Urfa today.
Ironically, it was the flood that destroyed that cathedral was what also brought about revealing of this image of Edessa when they found it in the wall above the west gate, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's quite. This is one of the sort of the facts of history, that Urfa was flooded about 3 or 4 times during the period that I believe the shroud to have been in that wall. And it's only because the location was very high and above the flood level that it would have survived. It's amazing the way the shroud has been through so many different events, right up to our own time, that have brought down whole buildings, solid buildings, and yet this seemingly frail piece of cloth comes through every time.
Even a fire in the cathedral in 1998.
That's right. Yep.
Well, it's
to correct your dating, 1997, but we won't fight on that.
Well, thank you. And again, this has been fascinating. We're going to be right back with the Shroud Report in just a minute. I'm Russ Brialt, and welcome back to the Shroud Report. Our guest today has been Ian Wilson, historian, author. Ian, this has been fascinating. I want to thank you for joining us here, and we wish you the best in your future excavations of Urfa and all the work you do. Do you have another book coming out soon?
I do. It's called The Bible is History, and that should be out, well, in the UK in the autumn, and hopefully in the States shortly after.
Wonderful. Look forward to getting it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here on the Shroud Report.
Thank you, Russ.
And thank you for watching the Shroud Report, and we'll see you next time.